Greetings, old school magic players, and welcome to the Four Horsemen.
For today's video, we have a special poem reading for our special people out there, and I think you know who you are. Arcane knowledge handed down, unwritten and obscure, governed, prosecuted, but no begging for remorse. One by one, they're taken as the bell rings its chime. Blasphemy against the church was her only crime. Tie her up and set the fire burning and torment alive. For her crimes, for her sins, the bitch will be burnt at the stake alive. Old school Magic players were also happy to announce tournament number 3, starting September 17th. This is still the wildfire fest of the Four Horsemen. No changes to the format, banned and restricted list. You may sign up for this tournament number 3 at talaria.app/events. We are in the last stretch of our Meyer Jr. Guardian Beast Brother Moonlight Special Edition signed, numbered PLAYMATS Kickstarter. You may back our Kickstarter by searching for Ken Meyer Jr. on Kickstarter.com. And old school Magic players, we have launched FourHorsemenMagic.com, the official Four Horsemen website. Join us here to find information on our Kickstarter, our projects, and playmats with Magic the Gathering old school artists, our calendar of events including our online tournaments and in-person events, our mission, our format rules, and much more. Despite all attempts to thwart us with lies and hatred, the Four Horsemen Old School Magic Group is now over 500 members strong. Thank you to all of our loyal Old School Magic the Gathering Four Horsemen players for joining and supporting us. You may get your Four Horsemen bag at etsy.com/shop/the4horsemen. For your viewing pleasure, today we have Brian Weissman commentating on tournament number 1, the finals. We have released a multi-part video series with Brian Weissman and his Kansas Sideboard, commentating on our tournament number 1 final matches. Join us on our YouTube channel for more videos from Brian and Gandalf Sideboard. With Gandalf Sideboard on European holiday with his family, the Chancellor will be sitting in with Brian Weissman commentating. For your viewing pleasure today, we continue with the quarterfinals of Four Horsemen Tournament number 1. Arnold was victorious in the previous round, and now Michael Sheff will showdown with Victor Alvarez. The rule of Victor Alvarez is a blue black abyss shop's romance decks, interacting and also curious twists. For the spicy blue of Michael Sheff, he's running a blue-red workshop's romance deck, also splashing in it. And now, old school Magic players, the moments you've been waiting for. The Four Horsemen inaugural tournament #1 quarterfinal showdown.
All right, we're back again. I'm Brian Weissman. I'm here with my good friend Chad, and we are going to be covering another Four Horsemen match. This match was played, I think, roughly we're almost a month post tournament finals now.
Yep.
Something like that.
Yep.
Last time we actually covered another quarterfinals match that was played between Arnaud Avenal and Adam, also known as That's Triflin. A really, really cool game involving a red, white, green land tax Land's Edge build against a workshop deck, which is sort of seemingly the two pillars of the Four Horsemen format. To remind anyone who's tuning in for the first time, the Four Horsemen format is a brand new nascent old school format that was pioneered by Chad and a couple of his associates, trying to kind of create an alternative to the established old school formats, which involve usually a card pool spanning the alpha set all the way to either the Dark or the Fallen Empires. And Chad and his friends were trying to innovate and come up with something new and novel, and touched on the idea of removing the alpha set. What happens when you remove all of the iconic alpha cards from the old school pool? What are you left with? Well, that's the Four Horsemen format. And the Four Horsemen of this format, you can see the booster packs laid out in front of you, although not completely in chronological order. We've got Arabian Nights, Antiquities, Legends, and the Dark. And as many people predicted, actually, a couple of deck archetypes have risen to the top. They are well represented in the quarterfinals matches. But one of the important things that the founders wanted to entrench with this format was giving people the room and latitude to experiment, to kind of have it be the Wild West, to go with the Horseman theme. And in the Wild West, kind of all bets are off, which means that there might be some overpowered degenerate strategies that people are going to probably exploit because people want to win at the end of the day. And so in that first match, Arnaud managed to prevail 2-1 against Adam's land tax deck. Arnaud's deck playing mono blue workshops. It was actually quite a fascinating matchup. Unfortunately for Adam, his deck is built around land tax, and he only managed to draw a single copy of land tax in all three games, and only by mid-game. He never had the dreaded turn one land tax opening, which is really how his deck functions, and consequently he was really struggling on the back foot for most of those games. Mm-hmm. But that's not what we're covering today. We're covering another quarterfinal matchup. This time it's between old school stalwart and very well-known player Michael Sheffenacker, who's a big part of the old school community, of great player, great deck designer. And he, of course, unsurprisingly, is in the finals of this, or sorry, not the finals, the quarterfinals of this inaugural event. And Michael is playing a blue-red shops deck that he called the Ham Sandwich, mainly because he kind of threw it together in the kitchen a few hours before the tournament began. We've actually covered his deck in a previous video, so I'm not going to cover that again. But he's been very successful with it. And his opponent, Victor, I'm going to try to pronounce this correctly, Arisis, I believe from Italy. Hopefully that's correct. Victor is playing a kind of another take on the workshops archetype. And he's made a bunch of really interesting decisions along the way. In fact, when I was brainstorming, when Chad first told me about the event, blue-black was kind of where I landed, actually. And it's really nice to see a devoted blue-black strategy in here. Although if you really look at the deck laid out in front of us right now, it's black kind of, I mean, it has Abyss. It's basically mono blue with the Abyss. He does have some blights in the sideboard, which we'll get to, but primarily the deck is mono blue. So I'm going to go and talk about some of the individual deck choices that set Victor's deck apart from some of the other shops deck. And that's going to lead me straight up to the upper left-hand corner. That's right. That's copies of the card Colossus of Sardia in a top 8 deck, which is, I think, really indicative of how cool and brand new this format is. Colossus of Sardia, if anybody who's watching was playing back when Antiquities came out, was kind of the big chase Timmy card of the set. All the Timmys saw a 9/9 with seeming, I mean, it has a drawback that you have to pay a bunch of mana to untap it, but it was also released at the same time as Urza lands were released and Candelabra of Tawnos, and untapping it. Basically, the belief was that if you could cast Colossus of Sardia, you could untap it. And it's an enormous creature. It has trample, which is really key for a big creature. And it kind of blew people's minds because up to that point, all the giant creatures in Magic were required some kind of an upkeep. Either you had to sacrifice stuff to untap them, or you had, in the cases of the big creatures from Arabian Nights, you had to sack lands, or you had to take damage, or you had to pay an inordinate amount of mana, or you had to sack a creature like Lord of the Pit. Colossus Sardia just came down and was a 9/9, and you didn't have to pay anything for it. You could smash for 9, and you could untap it on your discretion, which was actually seemed like it was a great card. But of course, over time, people realized that a 9-drop that you have to invest in during your upkeep every single turn to attack with was a little bit prohibitive, and it never really saw much play. So it's really cool to see a format where that card can shine. What did you think, Chad, when you saw Colossus of Sardia showing up?
Well, I have a few things to say, but I don't want to give any spoilers away. We saw several decks. I believe 3 decks in total, Brian, out of the top. I think we had, what did we have? 20? No, we had 28 players. We saw 3 decks that had Colossus, and some had 4, some had 2. But just seeing Colossus, I mean, I had not seen Colossus since probably I had one in my deck on the street, back in '95, right?
Yeah.
And I love that about this format. When you were mentioning earlier about when you remove the baseline sets, what it does is it forces you to play cards that you would not otherwise play, but which are also very good in their own right in this particular niche. So Colossus made a showing in several decks, obviously all robots. And if the players get that out, it's so hard to deal with. If you don't have a Divine Offering or a Dust to Dust or something, or a Maze of Ith, it's just like you're going to be dead so fast. So I thought it was an interesting choice. And they're putting in the Colossus instead of other, other options, right? In the case of Victor here, he's running 3 transmutes, not 4. He's running 3 workshops, not 4. And I feel like he worked to squeeze in the Colossus because of the mana drain, transmute, Suchi synergy.
Yeah, I think that's. I think your analysis of that is quite astute. Actually, I think that it's not too unlike what we've seen in some of the other singleton or budget formats where people have innovated in old school. And basically, I describe it as a lot of these kind of fringe cards are priced out by the fact that you can play with 4 of things that are just generally considered more powerful and more competitive. And that's particularly true in when you have alpha in the set, because there's so many cards from that set that are just incredibly strong. It's truly, it really speaks to Richard Garfield's design genius, but Alpha just has so many powerful cards in it that are honestly competitive in Vintage to this day. We know about the iconic cards, the Moxes, Black Lotus, Ancestral, the stuff that's obviously broken, but there's a lot of other really incredible design in Alpha that you really come to appreciate when you're not allowed to play with it in the old school card pool. And certainly Disenchant's overriding strength and its overall versatility in old school format is really evident in this one. You would never, ever play Colossus of Sardia in a format where everybody is playing 4 Disenchants.
That's right.
It's just going to show up in every deck. Divine Offering, however, is a great deal more narrow. It's still extremely powerful and has seen a ton of play in this format, obviously, when anybody is playing white. But at the same time, because you don't have access to Disenchant, you're not really drawn to white in the same way. And the other second half of that, which of course also relates to interaction with Colossus of Sardia, is Swords to Plowshares. Almost every deck in old school is playing either Disenchant or Swords or both. And the idea of investing 9 mana into something that your opponent can pay 1 or 2 mana to remove is prohibitive to most players. Anybody who's trying to be competitive and to try to win, which is why I described Colossus of Sardia as more of a Timmy card, because Timmy wants to play his thing. If it gets killed, it gets killed, but he got to cast it, and that's really all Timmy wants to do. He wants to slam Colossus of Sardia on the table. He doesn't care that his opponent just tapped 2 mana and gained 9 life. He got to play the Colossus of Sardia, and that's what that's his payoff, right?
Well,
attacking with it, that doesn't matter as much. Just slamming it onto the table and looking at his opponent to get that reation is where Timmy gets his dopamine.
That's right. So, I remember feeling that way about cards like Crawlworm and Force of Nature. Just being able to cast them and get them out there, or even some of the Elder Dragons. I remember the first time I saw Chronicles. I started playing in 95, and the first time I saw Chronicles and I saw the Elder Dragons, I was just like, oh my God, I have to play this card.
Yeah, elated. Exactly. Although for the most part, the presence of Elder Dragons in Chronicles historically was actually one of the reasons why we have the reserve list.
Yes. I've read a few articles about that.
Yeah, because it's funny. People think about how the reserve list protects the value of all of these things from alpha and stuff, but really the outrage when Chronicles was printed was people were pissed off that their prize Nicole Bolas was worth 25 cents and white bordered.
Yeah,
and it felt pretty horrible. Obviously, Urnam Jin, City of Brass, and stuff were in there. Some better constructed cards, but for the most part, I think the big complaints at the time. Urnam Jin, I think, was worth less than Nicole Bolas, for example. And because those big people were just still learning the game, and a lot of people were coming into the game for the first time.
Yeah.
7/7 flyer with trample, or that makes your opponent discard their hand, whatever the case, right? Insane. And power level. Forget about that little upkeep effect. Forget about the 8. This is a 7/7 flyer, man. That's pretty amazing. And I'm really, really angry that this Nicole Bolas that I spent a month trying to acquire and trade is now commonplace and worthless.
Well, even the art, I remember, and I think this is the reminiscent, kind of personal side of Magic. The art of these cards, I did as a kid. I was always drawing and sketching. I read comics. I tried to draw the cool themes from the comic books I collected. I was very into art, very into drawing, and Magic. The art of Magic was something that really pulled me in the first time I saw the cards. And when I remember seeing, the Elder Legends like Nicol Bolas and some of the others, and I just loved that dragon, the big, old, wise, magical dragon that looks so powerful. So there was definitely, as a kid, something fun about slapping down not only the big heavy hitter, the big baller, the fatties, as we called them back then, maybe not so PC these days. But that's what we called them. And it was not only putting down the heavy hitter, it was the coolness of the art.
Yeah, I think that can't be understated. I'm sure we'll have conversations about this down the road, but I think one of the things that really pushes a lot of people to old school format, particularly the nostalgia associated with it, is just how iconic these art pieces are, how evocative they are. Yeah. And I really think that mainly one of the main reasons behind that is the fact that all the art in the original game was all made from actual hand paintings.
Yes, no digital. No, whatever.
I've seen a lot of the original paintings, and they're just as impressive, if not more impressive, live. In your hands than they are condensed down into a little thumbnail thing. And over time, Magic art has turned into digital paintings exclusively. Yes, and artists because the production schedule of modern Magic design, a new set will come out. It'll have like 800 pieces of art in it or something. Yeah, they need to just crank them out because of the way they monetize the game now. Every card has 3 or 4 different versions of it art-wise. And in that case, you're just going to basically be outsourcing all your art, and everything is going to be produced digitally in a big sort of mass art mill. A consequence of that is that you get these very elaborate digital paintings that are condensed down to tiny little thumbnails, and they just look like shit, honestly. They look like weird little muddy detailed stuff. None of the cards have any flavor. I honestly couldn't tell you what most of the cards even look like. And it's so weird when I see a bigger version of a card that I've played with a bunch and I don't even recognize what it is. Yeah. Because outside the context of the frame and the casting costs and stuff, I have no idea what the art even is. Whereas these pictures are totally evocative. They're simple, they're stark, they're gorgeous paintings, and they reflect the style, an actual style and aesthetic. I couldn't tell you what the style is of any modern Magic artists at all, even though I played with a lot of these cards. It's just, it's a transformation in the game. Unfortunately, as many things go, as they progress through time, the overriding concern becomes, how can we monetize this better? How can we make more money for the company and for our shareholders? Right. And that means making a lot of relatively cheap and interchangeable art pieces that nobody cares about.
And fast,
And fast, right? Exactly. It's quantity over quality. I'm going to move on with the analysis of the deck as quickly as we can here, so we can get to the games. So 4 copies of Suchi, I think that's a given. It's an absolute nearly best of creature in the format, 4/4 for 4 stat line. There is mana burn in the format, so you do have to be a little bit wary of being able to find a place for the mana to go. He does have 2 copies of Jalem Tome to help support that. But you'll notice, actually, I'll talk about this more when we get to the mana base, but Victor elected to have no Mishra's Factories in his deck at all, which to me speaks of a tremendous oversight. I know why he's gone in that direction, and that's because it's kind of hard to fit in all the colors. You're playing blue and black and strip mine and workshop and factory, and pretty quickly it becomes pretty difficult to run both your blue and your black spells, particularly a double when you're running what you see here, 7 copies of cards that cost UU, and he's got some additional ones in his sideboard. He's got 3 copies of Transmute Artifact and 4 copies of Mana Drain. Getting blue without your opponent having blue mana to activate your Fellwar Stones is tough to do. And you're going to have a bunch of these games where you draw Mishra's Factories and you're not going to draw black or blue, or you're not going to draw sufficient amounts of those. And you might struggle in some of those games. In other formats where there's lots of factories, you've got alternative mana costs. You also have a lot of cheaper things and a lot of things that cost 1 color specifically, and you can kind of get away with it. Plus, you often have games that are just Mishra's Factory games where nobody is doing anything but just playing and killing factories at the beginning of the game, or strip mines. And so you have time to draw into your colored sources. And so maybe Victor recognized that that he didn't want to play that game. He wanted to just make sure he had UU on turn 2 consistently, and he could start casting his blue spells right away. He's only elected to run 1 copy of Tetravis, which is kind of interesting. We've seen a lot of Tetravis in some of the other shops' deck lists.
Yeah.
And what do you think of that decision? Do you think that it makes sense to run only 1? Would you?
Well, you know,
ever seen more?
Moat was a big concern from many of the players, although it didn't make a huge showing in the top 8. So he does have the Serendib Efreets, but as we've seen in some of the other earlier matches, if your opponent drops a Maze of Ith, which it's a 4 of in almost all of these decks, Serendib Efreet really can hurt you. So I'm actually kind of surprised that we only see 1 Tetravis here, and also only 3 Triskelions. Triskelion is such a powerhouse, being able to use those counters. Plus, he's got the Coffin. But I noticed he's got a lot of defense in this deck between the Abyss, the 3 mazes, and he's got the draw engine of the Jalooms. I have to assume in an earlier version of the build, he had probably 4 Triskelions and 2 or 3 Tetravis, and he narrowed it down. And it looks like to me he narrowed it down in exchange for an extra Jaloom Tome. Instead of running 1, he's running 2, and then he's got the Force Spikes, which I think he's making some conscious compromises and leaving out the extra Tetravis and Triskelion. Yeah,
I mean, it's just an example of you only have 60 cards to work with, right?
And well, not necessarily.
You've got to run a baseline amount of mana, and he's actually running. I haven't actually done a full count here. It looks like 23 mana sources in lands and 4 Fellwar Stones. So quite a bit of mana, 27 total, alongside the 3 Mazes of Ith, which gives him a total of 30 mana and or things that cost nothing.
Yeah, Maze of Ith obviously doesn't generate mana, so I would.
Yeah, he's got 30 spells in the deck. When you only have 30 spells in the deck and you want to play with a big blue component as well as black, you're going to have to make some very uncomfortable compromises in terms of the balance of artifacts that you're running. And I suspect that Victor's design kind of reflects what you would expect with a brand new format where people are still innovating and experimenting and figuring it out. What the hedge that a lot of people make when they're building decks like this is you see a lot of 3s. It seems like a lot of people will run 3 of a card versus 4. 4 is something. You put 4 copies of a card in a deck when you know this is obviously something I want to always have in my, as much as possible in as large quantities as possible in my opening hand. So a card like Su-Chi fits that bill. A card like Mana Drain fits that bill. You'd probably run 12 Mana Drains if you could. And as a result of that, that's an automatic 4 of. Things like Triskelion, things like Abyss, you can see the Tetravis and so on, even Transmute Artifact, they feel a little more situational, and you can envision times when you might not feel so good about having multiple copies of that card early. So when it comes down to like, well, I need to fit into Abyss, I'm going to have to cut something here or there. Well, I've got 4 Triskelions. that might be a little much. I'm going to cut one of those, and now I've got 3. And pretty soon you find yourself with 3 of this and 3 of this and 3 of this. It's almost always a telling component of a deck that the player hasn't had a lot of opportunity to really do sufficient testing of. So they're kind of just operating based on instincts. You see there's 3 copies of Maze of Ith as well. And so that, to me, that smacks of the fact that the format is brand new. He even has 3 Mishra's Workshops, which to me seems like a completely insane decision, given the fact that it's probably the most powerful unrestricted card in the format.
Yeah.
Maybe alongside it's either that or it's land tax, right? Mana Drain is totally insane too. But one of the problems with Mana Drain is that you need degenerate things to do with Mana Drain. And using Mana Drain to just cast a 4-drop or cast a 6-drop that your opponent can remove for 1 or 2 mana is strong, but it's not really that great. Mana Drain is really at its best in old school format when it's fueling card draw or card discard. It's Mana Drain your 5, untap, play this, cast Time Walk, cast Time Twister, that kind of thing. That's when, or cast a Brain Geyser for 8 or something. That's when the card is really, really incredibly powerful. And actually that's why it's still impactful in old school, even when you're only allowed to play with 1 copy of it, because you can save the Mana Drain for a key situation and use it. It's not just a utility counterspell. And using Mana Drain to power out something big seems good in theory, but it's almost always possible for your opponent to just counteract that huge play with something that costs less mana and only a single card. So the card is not as insane as a card like Workshop, which can enable an entire strategy, can enable overwhelmingly fast starts. And land tax, of course, totally insane. 1 mana to pull all the lands out of your deck and effectively draw 15 cards for almost for free, for almost no cost. So you'll see 4 copies of those. I'm going to move through the deck quickly. So yeah, you see he's got one Tetravis. There's only 3 Triskelions. I wanted to point out that the Triskelion at the very top, the white bordered one, the Anomaly, has a stamp on it. And that's obviously come from it. This is 0 point. So I believe this came actually from the 7-point old school singleton community. This looks like one of those manufactured prizes. I think Mikkel Fee makes these. Yes. And I just wanted to acknowledge that. But I believe they've had a couple of alternative tournaments where they've, rather than allowing their players a 7-point budget, they've only given them a 0-point budget. You can see that it looks like Victor prevailed in that event, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, obviously he's seasoned. And Mikhail, a nod to Mikhail. Mikhail also did the Four Horsemen logo for us, which was awesome. And yeah, you can see that Victor's obviously seasoned and he's taken some prizes. So he's not making these decisions lightly, but I'm mystified by the 3 workshops too. This is your chance to run all 4 and dominate. So I'm curious. Maybe we can talk.
Yeah, it's a little weird. I mean, the more I look at this deck, the more I think that running black doesn't make sense, honestly. And I think that Victor has actually really suffered as a consequence of that. I think that he really wanted to play with Abyss because it seems like it synergizes so well with the rest of what the deck is trying to do. But you need to have a reason to play Abyss. I run Abyss in regular old school. And the reason why I run Abyss is because all of the aggressive decks generally are running a ton of low to the ground, cheap creatures that Abyss just munches on, with the exception of Order of Elite Board. Everything else, it just kills. And there's a lot of the most aggressive decks can't really get rid of it too. Probably the best aggressive deck is red, blue, black Atog. And its creatures tend to be Atog and Cern of Efreet and Factory, and Abyss just crushes them. If you have an Abyss out, depending on how they sideboard, you sometimes do take out one or sometimes both of them. But if you have an Abyss in play, it just kills a lot of the cards in their deck, and they don't really have any way of interacting with it outside of Chaos Orb. So the card seems powerful in theory, but this format is kind of defined and dominated by 2 archetypes: Shops, which doesn't really run creatures that Abyss cares about, and land tax, which doesn't run really creatures at all. And that means that Abyss kind of doesn't really have a place to thrive in the format, and it's probably more suitable to the sideboard. And as a result of that, and Victor's gone through all of these contortions to fit Abyss into his deck. How much stronger is this deck if he doesn't run the Abyss and those 4 swamps are 4 Mishra's Factories instead? It's probably a lot better, to be honest. And my suspicion is that he probably found himself sideboarding out those Abysses constantly and lamenting the fact that he had swamps in his deck instead of factories or more islands. Wow. He's only run 1 copy of Taunus's Coffin, which we saw as a massive all-star in the last match. So that's another card I would have probably liked to see a couple of, more than 1 copy of. I do love the 2 Jalem Tomes. In fact, I think the build that I made of this deck had 3 copies of it because there's such a dearth of card draw. It's just so easy to get stuck in a situation where you're just top decking lands, and he's running 1 million mana sources also, where you're just top decking redundant lands and you just can't get through them. There's no way to draw cards, and you're helpless because you're just behind on the board and there's no way to recover. So I think more copies of Jalem Tome makes sense. 4 Fellow Stones I really like. The acceleration is great. And then that lands us on the Mighty Transmute artifact, which is another one of the candidates for possible restriction in future events for this format. I know that you guys wanted to give people the tools to experiment, and so I was very glad to see Transmute artifact available. But when you see Colossus of Sardi in the upper left-hand corner, you're thinking, aha, now I understand why Transmute artifact is so attractive. And I don't know if you want to spoil anything that occurs in this game, but I'll leave that up to you. Did you want to make a comment about that, or should we just?
We'll cover it when it comes up for sure. It'll be glaringly obvious.
Yeah, but Transmute is amazing, and that may actually be one of the reasons why he is running these singleton effects. It does give you some sort of silver bullet type things. If you really need the Taunus's Coffin effect to untap, I guess, yeah, Colossus of Sardi enters the battlefield untapped. So although the Coffin makes it tap, so that's not a way to sneak around the Colossus of Sardi's untap ability. But it does allow you to recur Triskelions, as we know, to build extra counters up on Triskelion to make it bigger. You can do the same thing very slowly with Tetravis. And you can also, of course, just use it defensively like an Icy Manipulator to just lock out your opponent's best creature. And the card is just very powerful and flexible. And he's clearly one of his primary reasons for using it is the interaction between his 4 Su-Chi and Transmute artifacts. So imagine you play Su-Chi off a Workshop on turn 2, then you play an island and you transmute Su-Chi that you have to pay a deficit of 5 because that's the difference in casting costs between. I'm not sure what's going on with this.
Oh, Brian, I was just going to launch the Twitch stream so we can stream this while we're recording, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, I forgot to launch the Twitch stream, so here we go.
Oh, yeah, sure,
what that'll do is that'll allow folks to kind of watch with like a little bit of a delay while we're recording.
Yeah, it also puts it on Twitch TV too. It's
it puts it on Twitch for us. Yeah, so please continue.
So obviously the scenario I'm recounting doesn't quite work because of the because you need 5 mana to do it. But if you were to go Workshop, Felwar Stone, turn 2 Island, Su-Chi, following turn Island, Transmute, the Su-Chi going to the graveyard produces 4 generic mana by nature of going to the graveyard. You tap Felwar Stone for a 5th, and now you've got a Colossus of Sardia in play super fast. And I think that's sort of one of the reasons. And there's a lot of decks that will just fold to that. They can't attack through it. They can't remove it. It hits for 9 with Trample. You'll be hard pressed to untap it, but you may not even need to. It may just win the game for you by itself. And that was clearly the interaction that Victor was going for, I think, when he made the decision to run those 2 cards side by side. We've already talked about the Abyss. I do think that as powerful as Abyss is
for you. Why do you think he's running Serendib Afrits along with Abyss? Because this mystifies me about this build. I mean, the Abyss is going to potentially munch his Afrits.
I think that, again, getting back to the fact that he had to go through sort of contortions to make the deck work, I think that Serendib Afrit is incredibly powerful. It's certainly one of the best creatures in the format. It may be the best creature in the format, period. And certainly it is if you're not playing with Workshops in your deck. Arguably, Triskelion is probably better as Su-Chi if you're running the Workshops deck. But Serendib is, it's just insane on the power curve, and you don't have to deal with Sword Splashers killing it. People are more attracted to cards like Spirit Link than they would be in a normal format, because Spirit Link is sort of a nice little replacement, a sort of fixed version of Sword Splashers. And anybody who's had a Serendib Afrit Spirit Link knows how uncomfortable that position is.
Yeah.
But I think he wanted to run Serendib Afrits because he's running blue, and it's just an obvious decision to just run them. They're just so universally strong. He doesn't have a way to really accelerate them into play faster than turn 3, unfortunately. And one of the strongest components of Serendib is that single blue casting cost. So you can just ramp it out with Soul Ring and just random off-color moxes and stuff and start pressuring right away. And that certainly makes it weaker and less attractive. But I agree with you. The clash between Serendib Afrit and Abyss is problematic in the deck, particularly with regards to mana. And again, my suspicion is that in the games that Victor played as he learned his deck and he learned the format more, one or both of those cards probably found their way to the sideboard pretty frequently. And I imagine that in a lot of the games, he was keeping Serendibs and removing Abysses or vice versa. And probably had multiple games where he was drawing Serendibs and couldn't play them due to his own Abyss being in play. There is an interaction with Taunus's Coffin and Serendib, or any creatures that Abyss kills, where let's say you have 2 Serendib Afrits in play, you can, because Abyss targets as a triggered effect at the start of upkeep, you can say at the beginning of the turn, I'm going to use Abyss to target my own Serendib, and then I'm going to put it in Taunus's Coffin to protect it. That will actually satisfy the destruction trigger on the Abyss, and you'll be able to keep all your other creatures in play unmolested. So that does give you some kind of narrow workaround, albeit very slowly. And in that situation, you still have to resolve the 2 triggers on the Serendibs that you have in play, and you're still taking 2 damage a turn. So you're taking 2 to deal 3. It's not really great, but it does at least give you some kind of a way around it.
Yeah.
And so after the Serendibs, he's got 4 copies of Mana Drain. I mean, it's really the best counterspell ever printed. And certainly one of the things that attracted me to blue when I was first starting to look at building decks in the format. It struck me as being an outlier in power level and certainly a restriction candidate. But at the same time, based on the point that I made before, Mana Drain really shines when you're using it to cast card draw or discard spells. And you can't really do either in this format, which makes the card more balanced somewhat. It may still be too good, but it's certainly not nearly as strong as it is in regular old school format, or as it was in Type 1, or just Magic as it was known back in that era. And he's got 4 copies of Force Spike, which is another really interesting choice. This, I think, has also informed the lack of swamps that he's running in the deck. He's only running 4 swamps and 4 Fellwar Stones to support 2 copies of the Abyss. That's sketch city to me also. Like, I just think that statistically, when you only run 4, let's go back to our games that we covered last time.
Yeah.
And exchange swamp for land tax.
Mm-hmm.
And you're sitting in Adam's, that's Triflin's seat. You draw 1 swamp in 3 games if you're him, right? He only drew 1 copy of land tax in 3 games. He only had 4 copies of it.
Yeah.
So unless you're playing against an opponent who has swamps or black mana in their deck, you're not going to be able to cast Abyss in a lot of your games if you draw it. And to me, that's another really big. That's a very problematic point in the deck, and another reason why he probably was shunting the Abysses to the sideboard frequently. And he needs lots of blue because Force Spike doesn't work if you don't draw an island at the beginning of the game too, which seems unlikely given that he's got 12. But 12 isn't that many in a 60 card deck, honestly, in terms of blue sources. Most old school decks that run blue are running 16, 17, 18 blue sources, and it's much more consistent getting 1 or 2 early in that case. With only 12, there's games where you don't draw islands either. And so that makes Force Spike a lot worse. Obviously, the card is really, really strong at the start of the game, but by mid-game, it's terrible. It doesn't do anything at all, and you only have 2 Jalen Tomes to cycle it, so it becomes a liability. I think that the deck has a lot of neat ideas, but I think that there's a lot of clashing elements in here, and really a sign that the deck is brand new and that we're still coming to understand it. So moving to the sideboard, he's got is that Psychic Allergy?
That is Psychic Allergy. That is correct. 2 Psychic Allergies, and I
don't even know I honestly don't even know what it does.
Well, let's look it up real quick. Let's look it up real quick because that is a good card to look at. This is another element of the game, right?
PSY.
Oops. There are a lot of cards that we don't get to see. And we don't even necessarily know what they do, So here's Psychic Allergy right here. So choose a color. It's 2 blue and 3. It's an enchantment. Choose a color with Psychic Allergy. During opponent's upkeep, Psychic Allergy does 1 damage to opponent for each card of this color.
This card is so horrible. Jesus.
For each card that he or she controls, sacrifice 2 islands during your upkeep, or Psychic Allergy is destroyed. I mean, this is a baffling inclusion to
it's strange. I mean, obviously he must have just expected that there'd be some archetype where your opponent is just like flooding the board with green tokens or something, and that he'd play Psychic Allergy and deal 5 to them with it. I don't really understand it. It costs 5. The upkeep is completely untenable and unsustainable. It's just bizarre. And for some reason it costs $15. I guess it's just because it's old.
Yeah, it's an old dark card. Well, it's really cool, Mark.
Get that thing off the screen. I can't even look at it anymore. All right, let's go back to the. All right. So we got the Abyss, a 3rd copy of the Abyss. I imagine that probably came in a couple of matches, although it would have been tough, again, to cast 3 of those because he doesn't have any extra black mana sources in the sideboard, and going like almost even in Abysses versus Swamps to cast them is pretty tenuous. Second Tawnos' Coffin, which I think I probably would have liked to see in the main deck, although he does have those transmute artifacts. He's got a 2nd Triskelion. Sword of the Ages, kind of interesting card, probably in there as a way to kind of deal with stalemates. Obviously very, very powerful with Colossus of Sardia. And in fact, I think a lot of people saw that pairing when Legends came out. Certainly all the Timmies did. Went, awesome, I get to attack for 9 and then I can sack it when it's tapped. Because I think the Sword of the Ages... Oh, wait, does Sword of the Ages require the creatures to be untapped? I kind of think it does.
Well, let's take a look. Sword of the Ages is another one of those very like reminiscent cards, right? Where
Okay, no, it's just okay. Fortunately, it's just creatures you control, so it does not have that limitation. I just checked it.
okay,
I was thinking that like it enters the battlefield tapped because you
Okay,
know
yeah.
that effect is just way too good if you get to use it right away.
It comes in tapped, but there's no activation other than tapping it.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. You can hit free with your Colossus, and then you can sacrifice it to Sword of the Ages to deal another 9. Maybe you
Yeah.
can close up some games with that. He's got 4 copies of Boomerang. I think this card is kind of a necessary thing to have in the format if you're playing blue, because this deck just dies to Energy Flux. If Energy Flux comes out, the game's just over. You're not gonna be able to do anything probably, unless your opponent has literally nothing else going on. But the deck just doesn't function if Energy Flux is in play.
Right.
Particularly if you ramped out things with Workshop and Felwar Stones. it's just a nightmare to navigate. Anybody who's played Shops knows that the card is just your mortal enemy. He has 3 copies of Blight, which I would regard as totally uncastable. I guess maybe he sideboards in Blight against mono black, and but then you're blighting your opponent's black sources, and your Felwar Stones don't work anymore. So that's also problematic. And then it looks like a couple copies of Flash Flood, another card that I think is pretty good in the format. But I think Victor's deck really strikes me as being just quite unrefined. He's put it together. He's drawing on his instincts as an old school player and trying to do his level best. And I'm sure if he were to come back and play in another event, I think the deck that he would play would be substantially different if he went with this archetype at all. But with that said, let's go to the games. I think it's long overdue.
Okay. I've got the video queued up for us here. Michael recorded this for us, so it's a little bit different format. I'm going to see if I can turn off my camera so I'm not in a new share. And I think we're ready to go.
All right, we got to power through this. I got to get out of here in about an hour and
Okay, this match is about 20 minutes. So
yeah, we should be able to do it. We move quickly.
Here we go.
Oh, are we live now?
Yeah, we're live.
Yeah.
We're live. And I'm advancing to Michael drawing. Okay, I think we're ready now.
Okay, we are back for the first game of the quarterfinal match between Michael Scheffenacher and Victor Orisis. This is the shops on shops battle, although quite different takes on the archetype. Michael's playing a deck that he called the Ham Sandwich, a blue-red version of it. His opponent Victor is running blue-black, although only a real tiny little splash of black. They've gone with 2 different directions. It looks like Michael just resolved the mulligan, and he's on the play, leading with pretty much the best draw that this deck can have. Workshop Felwar Stone, minus Library of Alexandria. And on Victor's side, actually, that's an oversight I didn't mention when we were covering the decks. This is, I think, also a small consequence of the fact that playing blue-black, Victor had to make some tough decisions about what lands to run in his design. And he opted to run mostly blue with a splash of black. He only has 4 swamps, and he did not run factory, and he has no Library of Alexandria either. And I really should have commented on that during the game. I'm sorry, during the deck tech, because it is pretty impactful. Certainly one of the most powerful cards ever printed, and probably the single most powerful card in the entire format. And you're allowed to play with proxies, so card availability isn't really an issue. It's surprising to see that he didn't run the card. It may be that he has not used it very much in old school, and he may not appreciate just quite how good it is. So Michael's got very, even through the first strip mine, he's got Island, Factory, and Felwar Stone in play. Oh, and Victor discarding Abyss. Wow, what do you think about the decision to strip mine on turn 2? I mean, on turn 1 with clearly only 1 more mana in his hand.
Yeah, we've talked about this in the last match. I'll pause here. There's 2 sides to this coin, right? I mean, obviously you've got to get rid of that workshop because it's so powerful. But on the other hand, especially now that we've done the deck tech with Victor's deck, we know how important his mana is going to be for him as well. I can just speak from my experience in the games I've played. I find it's a mistake to strip mine too early. There are so many lands, including colors, right? Dual colors, as well as Maze of Ith and other problematic lands that you're going to need that strip mine. But I feel like he was forced to do it because Michael got it out so early.
Yeah, it's obviously a really, really tough decision to be in. This is one of those examples, I think, of a situation and a choice that you have to make in a game of Magic that you might make completely differently on a different day.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at exactly the same cards. Could pause real quick, please?
Yeah.
And you could make a very valid argument in both cases. I can think of reasons why you would strip mine there or not strip mine. I think that Victor's running 4 copies of Force Spike in his deck. He's also running 4 copies of Mana Drain, and he probably has a Mana Drain in his hand if he kept the hand at all, and 12 blue sources, and is probably reasoning that if my opponent goes turn 1 Workshop Felwar Stone, he's going to be able to play 5 drops as early as turn 2.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly he doesn't have a Force Spike in hand since his opponent just tapped out and he didn't cast it. So I don't have Force Spike in hand. I'm looking at multiple copies of Mana Drain. The guy played Workshop, and I know that I don't have a 3rd land in my hand, and that means that if I go turn 1 Island, turn 2 strip mine, and I don't draw another island right away, and he's got a Workshop just sitting there unbridled, he's going to be able to just drop giant robots on me over and over and over again. And even if I draw into my 2nd blue, these 2 Mana Drains in my hand aren't going to be doing anything, and I'm just going to die. So the strip mine makes the most sense. I need to strip mine now, hope that he doesn't have any land. He has a Felwar Stone, so he's not going to be able to use that on the following turn. It guarantees that I get at least 1 more draw step to draw into either Force Spike or Mana Drain, even though that means that I may not be able to do anything on the 2nd turn. So in that case, the strip mine makes perfect sense. On the other hand, his deck doesn't operate on just 2 land, and he has 4 copies of Felwar Stone himself. And if he draws into Felwar Stone with only 1 mana available, then he can't cast that either. And in that case, Michael may have another Workshop in his hand already, or he might have another bunch of other lands, or he might have a bunch of Factory in his hand too, and you're going to be helpless against all of those draws.
Mm-hmm.
I think the actual answer here, if you're Victor, is you mulligan that hand.
Yeah.
You do not keep a hand with a strip mine and an island. You simply can't do that. Also, I don't know whether or not he knows Michael is running Abyss in his deck, but is running like all shops, but assuming that he knows anything at all about Michael's deck, he probably recognizes that Abyss has no value in the matchup anyway, and assuming that he had that in his opening hand, alongside clearly no way to cast it, that's like he already started with a mulligan to begin with. He already has a 6-card hand since he's got a dead uncastable card, which makes the mulligan even more powerful. We know he doesn't have Force Spike. That's his early interaction. And I really think that clearly the fact that he had only 2 lands and he discarded Abyss is strong evidence to me that he should have just mulliganed anyway.
Yeah, you make some really good points there, Brian. Just for the record, we did release the top 8 decks once everybody made it to top 8. Now, whether or not the players, we have players from all over the world. I think Victor, as we mentioned, I think he's from Italy. We don't know if the players spent time looking at the decks. I put the tournament report together as part of our collaboration here. That was done after the tournament completed. So all the deck images for the top 8 were put into the Facebook group and shared, but I don't know if Victor looked closely. I have to agree with you. I think his 2 moves were hope that he could either play a Felwar Stone on turn 2, saving the strip mine 1 extra turn, and then if he got the Felwar Stone out, he would have double blue from Michael's island, or like you said, strip mine. But the other thing is, as you mentioned, Michael kind of got the god hand of his deck. He got the Felwar out first turn with the Workshop, so Victor's just on his back heels with a bad hand, and Michael is coming out swinging.
Yeah, definitely. And this is obviously more evidence of why you really want to run 4 copies of Workshop in this archetype.
Right.
If you decide to play it because you want to draw a Workshop turn 1, it puts insane pressure on your opponent and forces him to do things like strip mining turn 1 when he only has 2 land.
Yeah.
So presenting your opponent with those really uncomfortable situations proactively is one of the key strategies to make competitive decks run. So you can see Michael's slammed down a 3/1 Regenerator, another card you'd never really see outside of maybe limited formats way back in the day. Mm-hmm. It was an all-star in the this is getting worse. An all-star in the in the very first draft event back in the Pro Tour. Pro Tour number 2 was 4th edition Homelands draft, and in that format, Clay Statue was incredibly powerful, oddly enough. But it's funny to see it in this format. It looks like Michael probably is just going to attack for 5 here. I imagine, and just sit on mana drain. Oh, he's boomerang an island. Oh, just extra brutal. Yeah, he comes in for 5. So he's just going purely proactive. This game seems like it's going to just be over in a hurry.
Yeah.
Double discard a single island play. I wouldn't be surprised if Victor just packs it in right now.
Yeah.
Given how far behind he is, he's going to have to discard now again, no matter what happens, by nature of the fact that he had 9 cards in his main step. We'll see what he's going to throw away.
So this is more evidence that mulliganing was the right choice. I think Victor took the risk, kept a marginal to very bad hand, and it's costing him the game.
Yeah, very likely. And keep in mind, Michael is running 4 copies of Mana Drain as well. So even if Victor is able to draw into some mana here, he may just be walking spells into 1 or 2 copies of Mana Drain anyway. Drawing another card. If I don't see a land come down here, I cannot imagine that the game will continue beyond turn 2. I mean, beyond the turn. Yeah, he throws away Transmute.
Yeah.
I think we can effectively close the book on game 1. 5 more comes in. Michael hasn't even played anything else other than the boomerang. He shows him Mana Drain. There's no way around that. And of course, we'll move very quickly to game 2. So unfortunately, not a particularly interactive game. That'll at least give Victor an opportunity to sideboard. So let's pause real quick and talk about sideboard choices.
Sure.
Bring up the decks real quick.
All right.
I'll let you decide who you cover first here.
Well, let's see who's first up. So sideboarding, let's start with Victor.
Okay, we'll go to Victor. I've got his deck in front of me as well. All right, so yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things that are super obvious. If you actually look at Victor's deck, he doesn't really have a lot of cards in the sideboard that are particularly well suited for this matchup. Not that you could run a lot of things anyway, but if you remember back to our last match, we saw that Hurkyl's Recall actually played a pretty big role in that matchup, in the mirror matchup. And unfortunately for Victor, he has Psychic Allergy in his sideboard instead of Hurkyl's Recall. So that's not gonna be an option. Clearly, the Abysses will come out, and it's actually interesting too because if you remember back to Michael's deck list, he's running 4 copies of Atog, and Abyss does give you some good interactivity with Atog, and it may come up as a surprising threat in the second or third games if we do in fact go to the third game. So be interesting to see if that matters. Other than the 2 copies of Abyss coming out, I'm curious to know what you think he might also choose. If you were sitting in Victor's seat after that first game drubbing, what would you be looking at in the sideboard right now, Chad?
Well, I would like to put in my 4 blights, but frankly, I would be afraid I'll never be able to cast them.
Yeah, how could you ever cast them?
I mean, the double black. I mean, maybe he meant to put in 4 City of Brass at some point in this deck.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that, actually, and I realized this is something I was just thinking about that when we were between games. A huge oversight, obviously. I think that if ever a deck needed 4 copies of City of Brass, it's this one.
Yes.
Right? Why is he not running 4 copies of City of Brass? He's had to elect to not run Library and not run 4 copies of Mishra's Factory in order to somehow tortuously jam 4 swamps into his deck list. But he could easily swap 2, 3, or even 4 of those islands with 4 copies of Cities of Brass. It would really smooth out the mana in the deck a lot, give him the ability to cast his black main deck and sideboard spells, and maybe even give him access to some extra black tools in the sideboard, which he of course can't cast at all. And so that's really surprising to me, actually, and another thing that he would probably correct if he were to build the deck again. But yeah, go back to what we were saying.
Yeah, so I mean, if I had 4 City of Brass, I would be popping in those blights right away, because between the 4 strip mines and the 4 blights, he may have a better chance of shutting down Workshop. You've got 8, at that point you've got 8 cards, plus your boomerangs would also be an option. That could be 12 cards that could give you some potential early game way to mitigate the Workshop. If you can shut down your opponent's Workshop, that may give you the time to develop your board. So I would like to put in the blights, but frankly, with only 4 swamps, I just don't see how that's doable. So, I mean, I guess he should bank on the 4 boomerangs and drop in his extra artifacts. Psychic Allergy only affects colors, right? It doesn't affect.
There's absolutely nothing in the matchup at all.
Yeah, so he's got, I guess, 7 cards that he could pop in, and he could pull out the Abyss, and maybe the Colossus. That would be 4 cards, and then he would need 3 more. Maybe the Force Spike should come out because Michael's going to have so much mana. I can't see him, falling prey to the Force Spike, missing only 1 mana when he's got all that ramp. So those are, I would target pulling out the Force Spikes, the Abyss, and the Colossus, and I would put in the Boomerangs, the 3 artifacts, and maybe 1 Blight.
Yeah, I think that, obviously he's in a really uncomfortable situation. He did see red mana, and I'm curious to know if you think that he's going to be frightened enough of the presence of red mana to maybe take a look at the active volcanoes, and also obviously the fact that his opponent is running mountains as well.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, not active volcanoes. I'm sorry, flash floods. That
Flash flood, right?
Eyeing flash flood as to get some extra interactivity.
Yeah,
and because he doesn't have, that's the thing about the shops on shops matchup, is that because the deck is pretty homogenous and it's kind of has a very routine and repetitive game plan, it's hard to really remove some of those key elements to bring in more situational cards. The deck, it's not a reactive deck; it's supposed to be proactive, and that's actually, I think, one of another kind of clashing component of Victor's design is that he's kind of going in too many ways at once. He's trying to be the aggressive shops deck. He's trying to be the combo-oriented transmute deck, but he's also running Abyss alongside Surrender Befreets, and he's running a ton of counter magic as well, while trying to also play lots of generic mana things and workshops. And it's just, the whole thing just doesn't really synergize all that well. And he's going to get a lot of ranges of hands where the elements just don't quite come together, versus what Michael is playing, which is a great deal more linear and consistent, I think, in terms of both mana deployment and the threats that it's presenting as well.
Yeah.
And so it's a real challenge. I would not want to be sitting in Victor's seat. I think that my take on this would be, obviously the 2 Abyss come out. I think Boomerang has some value, but I don't think that Boomerang is in his sideboard specifically for this match. If you want a card that really would shine in the matchup, it would be much more a card like Hurkyl's Recall that we already mentioned.
Right.
Blight, I think, is uncastable. Just Tetravis and Taunus's Coffin, I think, are both very, very good cards to have in the matchup, particularly since your opponent probably can't get rid of them as easily, although Michael does have access to red. Sword of the Ages might actually be kind of a card that he's planning on putting in there, expecting that they might do some damage to each other early, and then you can just kind of go face with it at the end once you've gotten into the long game and you've got a couple of tapped Colossus in play. So if I were him, I don't think I would play Boomerang. I don't think that I would probably be pulled into using Flash Flood. I might just take out the 2 Abyss and run something like Coffin, Triskelion, and maybe the Sword of the Ages, and just hope that that's enough. Let's go over to Michael's deck. If you could bring that up for me. Let's bring that up. And actually, looking at the deck list, something immediately jumps out at me that I'm a little puzzled by. We saw Michael cast Boomerang in game 1, and he doesn't actually have Boomerang in his main deck, as far as I can tell. It's over on the right side. There's 3 of them up there in the sideboard. So I suspect that what may have happened is that he had Boomerang in a previous game and may have just not pulled it out by accident.
Sideboard leftover?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really common thing. These are casual games, right? And there's no deck lists, there's no deck checks. People are kind of just having a good time, and I think that that's probably a symptom of that. So you'll notice, though, that Boomerangs are all sideboarded. I'm not sure what he would have pulled in advance of that, but the card's great. I mean, the card's decent. If you wanted to sideboard against, if you did want to have some sort of advantage in the first game in the mirror match, he probably would not have elected to play with Boomerang. He would have probably picked something more like Sage of Latinam, because that's really the kind of the all-star in the mirror.
Yeah.
But looking at Michael's deck, it's pretty well set up for the mirror already. Most of his sideboard cards seem like they're kind of designed to deal with more creature-based strategies, and doesn't really have a lot of things to change. We actually saw that he kept Chain Lightning in games that we didn't expect before, so that card may remain, although maybe expecting that his opponent might be using Sages of Latinam as well, because the card is just so powerful in the mirror that you just can't let it hang out, and Chain Lightning gives you some interactivity with that. I can't imagine that he thinks Yoshin Soldier is particularly valuable, or the clay statues.
Mhm.
So yeah, what do you think, Chad? Do you think what do you think he should bring in from the sideboard?
Yeah,
Looking
I
at
think
the
you're
cards
right.
he's got there.
Yoshin Soldiers, it's definitely got to go. Although, he doesn't know. I don't know if Michael studied the opponent's decks. Knowing now that I've gotten to know Michael, I would assume he has, and I would assume he looked at the top 8, and he probably took a quick gander. He may have looked at the images before the match, so he may know that there's no factories. So the soldiers have to come out. I would put in probably the 2 sages of Latinam or the 2 Serendib Afrits, and I would probably take out the city in a bottle and put in the other sage or the other Serendib, and just go with those 3 swaps. He does have the mirror universe, so he could pull out the mirror and put in a second Serendib, and then you've got swapping out 4 cards for 2 Serendibs and 2 sages for more aggro.
Yeah, I did want to actually point out, it's very interesting that Michael picked up on just how good Mirror Universe is in this particular format. One of the things that you and your co-developers wanted to do is really recapture as much of the sort of ethos and card interaction of the era. And one component of that is that Mirror Universe was actually for years probably the most powerful way to win a game of Magic, because there were several rules that really elevated the card to super powerful levels compared to how the card plays out in contemporary old school. The first, of course, is that the format uses mana burn. So Mirror Universe combined with mana burn gives you the ability to have direct agency in your life total the whole time. You can use both mana burn and Cities of Brass to reduce your life total really rapidly once the card's in play, and then swap life with your opponent. But on top of that, you've gone with that very, very antiquated rule that was quite confusing and retired for good measure back with the 6th edition rules, which said that you only died in a game of Magic if you ended a phase of the game at 0 or at negative life totals. This is why the Prosperous Bloom deck of the day was able to go and cast Contract from Below. I'm sorry, not Contract from Below, Infernal Contract repeatedly when it had 0 life without dying.
Right.
You could actually go into negative life totals with that deck, as long as you ended up the phase, i.e. via drain life, over 1 life point. If you could get to 1 life or above with drain life, you could actually still win the game even if you had been at negatives. And
that's right.
consequently, that also works with Mirror Universe. So imagine this: you cast Mirror Universe on turn, let's say 5 or 6 or something off a mana drain. You pass the turn. At the end of your opponent's turn, you mana burn for 6 or 7, and you take 2 extra points from Cities of Brass that you have in play, and you drop yourself down to, let's say, 2, because you've taken some damage. And then during your upkeep, the mirror is not a triggered effect, so you can actually just sacrifice it at any point during your upkeep. You tap 2 Cities of Brass. That puts 2 mana in your pool, and it also deals 2 damage to you. That drops you down to 0, but you're not dead because the phase hasn't ended. And then you sacrifice Mirror Universe. You hand your opponent your 0 life total, and you get all their life, and they die at the end of the phase. Which is incredibly powerful and very, very tough to interact with. And in fact, to make matters even more insane, and I don't believe you guys are playing with this rule because it really only applies to Mirror Universe, but you might want to consider using it anyway just to make the card more ridiculous. Back in that era, you could actually tap your lands for mana during the untap step. You were allowed to play mana sources during the untap step. So you could basically go at the end of your opponent's turn, tap all your mana, burn, untap your lands at the beginning of the untap step. But during the untap step, tap all your mana again, except for Cities of Brass, to mana burn during your untap step, during the transition between untap and upkeep. That would allow you to effectively double the self-inflicted damage and drop you down to, whatever, 1 or 2 life, and then you would do the City Mirror trick to actually finish them off.
Right.
You can't do that under current rules because you're not allowed to do anything during the untap step at all. So there's no opportunity to add mana to your mana pool and therefore mana burn from it. But back then you could actually do that too to make the card even more absurd and dumb.
And
so,
Brian,
fortunately,
we on the rules committee, we have a group of folks who are in the process of refining the rules. We're into tournament number 2 now. We're 2 weeks into tournament number 2, and we know that these rules are going to evolve and change. But as we mentioned in the last video, one of the things we wanted to do is give the voice of the community a chance to have a say. And we took a poll, and we asked everyone about the updated banned and restricted, which we kind of reviewed in the last video as well. And everyone voted to leave everything the way it was. Everyone wanted another shot at the Wild Wild West. So I'm I'm certain that the rules are going to be improved upon, and it's going to be a delicate balance between how do we still capture that late 1994 Magic feeling, but also have rules that are reasonable. And this is a niche format. We're not going to ever displace Atlantic or displace Eternal Central or Swedish, but there is a certain experience that you get from playing this format, and the rules are an avenue to that. So, we're going to try and balance preserving that goal of the 1994 mechanics and feeling, but also, have some special rulings to deal with these problematic scenarios. I remember people switching life with Mirror Universe in the upkeep on me all the time. So that was definitely one of the key ways to win back in the day.
Yeah, definitely. I think that probably for the sake of continuity, it's, and certainly in terms of how it works intuitively, allowing people to mana burn during the untap step is a can of worms you don't need to open.
Yeah,
because it's just bizarre. It was legal for a relatively short period of time, and it made Mirror Universe even more disgusting than it already is in this old format. But it's remarkable to me to not see the card played as much as it is, and I assume it's unrestricted too. So
it is unrestricted. Yes, it is.
Yeah, and with Workshop and Mana Drain in the format, it's actually something I hadn't considered. But I think building a kind of turbo mirror deck would actually be a pretty effective way to win some games of Magic in Four Horsemen. If anyone's listening, but Michael's not running library either. That's something we mentioned before. I think as far as the sideboard is concerned, I agree with you. I don't think that Yoshin Soldier, he probably, he's assuming he has done his homework. He probably knows that he isn't playing against opposing factories, and Yoshin Soldier is clearly in the deck for that purpose. He wants to have some sort of lower to the ground things to do with early workshops, and that gives you some nice interactivity and the ability to block a relatively large Mishra's Factory since it's a 1/4. So I could see those two coming out. Yeah, I agree with you. City in a Bottle, totally useless. His opponent is not even playing Cities of Brass while Michael is. So, of course, that card has to come out as well. That's 3. Clay Statue, not great, not horrible, but I think probably also not the reason why he's got that card in the deck. And I do think that Sage of Latnam, 100%. It's interesting, too, that he did see a Serendib Efreet get discarded as well as the Abyss. So probably a little bit confusing there, but at the same time, one of the best things about Serendib Efreet is it's a 3/4, and it's really good at blocking enemy Serendib Efreets. So if you're worried about your opponent playing Serendib Efreet, you can often kind of just use your own Serendibs as defense against theirs if you're in a game where you've fallen behind and you need to block. So that gives you an extra layer of defense against that hyper-aggressive threat. We saw how good Boomerang was in Game 1, even though it wasn't supposed to be a main deck card, but it was also good kind of in a very contrived situation, given that his opponent was discarding with a single land in play, and Boomerang's never going to be better than in that situation. So it'll be hard to say whether or not that would come in, but I could see him bringing in the 4 Serendib Efreets and possibly the 2 Sages of Latnam at a minimum, and cutting City in a Bottle, 2 Yoshin Soldiers, 2 Clay Statues, and maybe 1 or 2 Chain Lightnings, and just going with that build. But let's see what happens and move on to Game 2.
All right, I'm going to jump forward a little bit here, and it looks like these guys are drawing, and I think we can continue.
Still sideboarding, I think, actually. That looks
like sideboarding. Okay.
Sideboarding behavior to me. I think Michael probably has his own draw, but it looks to me like Victor is still sideboarding.
All right, I'll jump forward a little bit for us.
Just looking at those psychic allergies.
Going, why the hell did I put this shit in my deck? Oh, man. Yeah, I'd love to do an interview with some of the players. I know we've talked about that in some of the other games as well. I think that might be a fun video follow-up series, would be to try to do a few interviews and see, what were people thinking and why did they make certain decisions.
Yeah, entirely possible that it was one of those, I've always kind of liked this card. I like the picture. I just kind of wanted to play with it. All right, they're laying out their cards. So we've already done the deck cutting via the remote strategy of laying out 3 piles, numbering them 1, 2, 3, and then saying what goes on what. But it'll be interesting to see if Victor opts to go first here. We saw in some of the other games that people were opting to go second, and it looks like he has gone first. It certainly makes sense. He's got both Force Spike and Mana Drain. So we got Island versus Island, and here's the big test: does Victor have a second blue? He's got a swamp. Okay, well that's unlikely. That's actually much worse than an island, but he does have a Fellwar Stone, so he's got 2 blue. Michael will probably play another one himself. Both having really good starts here.
Yeah, much better starts for Victor for sure.
Yeah, turn 3 Su-Chi perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Drumming the fingers a little bit. Might see a Serendib Efreet here as well. That'll be really the big decision, whether he goes Serendib. Okay, he's got another Fellwar Stone. He could ramp into a Serendib as well. Yeah, that looks like that's what's going to come. It could be either Jalem Tome. All right, so he's kept the Serendib Efreets in. That's pretty expected. And now we'll see whether or not Michael also brought in Serendib Efreet. This is sort of the exact situation why you want to run them. Because the Serendib applies so much pressure, it looks like it's going to answer with either Triskelion or a Tetravis. And that's a pretty good race. I would definitely prefer to be the guy with the 4/4 over the guy with the 3/4 in this situation.
The damages you.
Yeah, but they're moving quickly. Victor could easily just play a 6th land here, and or 6 mana source, and answer with his own Triskelion. Of course, Serendib's going to attack for 3. Down comes Maze of Ith. That's a pretty nice answer to Triskelion. And now he's got sitting on potentially 2 mana drains. Looks like 3 cards in hand, and he passes the turn back. Yeah, and Michael, of course, by nature of his mana base, has opted to not run any copies of Maze of Ith. But I think that I actually agree with that. I think that just going proactive and just casting big creatures is probably just better anyway than messing around with Maze of Ith. There just aren't that many creatures that you need to be worrying about mazing if you're running a whole suite of big guys yourself. All right, down comes City and Atog, so we know he's kept those things in. Flagrant disregard for potential Abyss, but obviously the Abysses are in the sideboard anyway. And no reason to attack. This does give him 2 attackers, but unfortunately only one of them is going to be able to get through for 1 point of damage. And just passes the turn back. If he gets another Triskelion, of course, he has the option to kill a Serendib. But this is really where the card just shines in this matchup. 3/4 flyer, very robust, doesn't die to Chain Lightning. We've all been in this position, just getting beaten in the face by Serendib Efreet.
Yeah.
And passes it back to...
What a difference in this match, right? I mean, he's got the mana out early. He went first, got the Fellwar Stone on the second turn, and he's doing so much better here. But Michael is mounting a very robust defense, and that Atog, once you get the Atog out there, I mean, that guy can hit for so much if you're not careful. And then now he's got the Su-Chi with the potential for the transmute. So Victor's got to be very concerned here.
Yeah, I mean, I would still say that we're going to see whether or not Victor actually has a mana drain in his hand right now. I believe he has 3 cards. He's probably thinking about the Su-Chi as a threat if he does, in fact, have an answer to it. But the question is would he use a mana drain on a Su-Chi? He's already well ahead in the damage race here, although Michael does have quite a bit of burst damage through both the Atog and the arms on the Triskelion.
Yes.
He could tie the game up really, really quickly, and Victor does need to be careful. The other thing, too, is if he takes a bunch of damage and he draws a second Serendib Efreet, he's going to be a lot harder pressed to even be able to play it. Because if the game were to get stalled out a little bit, he might wind up just taking a ton of damage from his own Serendibs and just die.
Yeah.
But you see Michael playing another Atog here. Of course, he's going to attack with 2 of them. I think we're still waiting on a decision from Victor. No, it looks like the Atog resolves, so they're both coming in. Of course, he'll be mazing the Triskelion and taking 1 point, which will drop his life total down to 17.
Yeah, and him taking that extra damage each upkeep is starting to trickle in. I was saying earlier in our earlier video that Serendib has a huge drawback, particularly in this format, when you're very likely to be up against 4 Maze of Ith. So although it's great to get it out, second turn Fellwar Stone, third turn Serendib, if they drop a Maze or, like you mentioned, a Spirit Link, it's very painful.
Yeah, it's certainly very painful. I'm trying to think about what Victor might actually have in his hand right now. I bet you he's got at least 1 copy of Force Spike right now. And it's one of those situations where Force Spike is it's so awkward, right? Michael never tapped out to play anything. He was able to cast his 6-drop off of a workshop with 2 blue floating. And Victor has 4 copies of Force Spike in his deck, and only 2 copies of Jalem Tome, so no way to get rid of them. You saw him actually play an Island there too, and so he's not even thinking about holding that potentially to draw into Jalem Tome. The life totals are 16-9, but now he's facing a ton of pressure. He's going to be able to maze one of those creatures, but he's going to be taking 6 on the attack back plus an additional damage from his turn. And in fact, Michael is now ahead in this race as well.
That's what I was worried about, him pulling ahead with all the aggression. Maybe maybe Victor's holding a couple of Force Spike and a couple of Colossus, that kind of scenario, something like that. Because I'm surprised he hasn't played more defense.
Yeah, this is a very interesting play. So he's playing a transmute pre-combat step.
Yes.
And what do you think he's getting here?
Oh, I know exactly what's going on here. So this is the...
Okay, for no spoilers. Well, I'll try to speculate. I mean, I can only imagine maybe he has enough mana to go and get another Triskelion.
Yeah, I don't want to blow it for you. Speculate away, Brian. Just...
All right, yeah.
Go through the logic here.
He's counting his mana here, but if I were him, I'd be really, really reluctant to tap those 2 Cities of Brass if I didn't need to. He's already winning the race here, and transmuting the Fellow Stone. I mean, depending on what happens, he does have to sack it. Okay, so he is getting another Triskelion. This strikes me as being very risky, unless he's just assuming that he's going to just blow up that opposing Surrender Befreet. But I think I probably would have attacked first just to see what happens. He comes in here. Victor will maze one of the 4/4s.
I think Michael's logic here is I've got him on the ropes and I'm coming in heavy. I've got potentially 6 damage through the Triskelions. I can sack the Triskelions to the Atogs. If he doesn't block them, I can sack the Suchi, although that would cost him damage. Probably not going to do that. I think those Atogs, if you get a double sack and you take the 6 from the Triskelion arms, it's just a lot of damage in one turn. And then he takes the point during his upkeep as well.
Yeah, the thing that I just don't, the part of it I don't understand is doing this before attacking. Mainly because he's got to know that his opponent has Boomerang. And if his opponent has Boomerang and he's going for this sort of all-in Atog play by tapping out before attacking, his opponent has 3 cards in hand and hasn't done anything for a while. It's totally within the range of possibility that Victor may have 1 or even 2 Boomerangs or something like Burkle's Recall. There's like lots of things that he could have here. And you don't have any information and you have no interactivity if you tap out before you even attack to know that.
Yeah. So here we go.
Here we go. Need the Triskelion to play. Okay. Or maybe is this just a lethal play here?
I think he's trying to go for lethal play. He did what I was thinking he might do, and he's looks like he mazed one of the Triskelions, and then
so he's backing the mazed Triskelion. He fires off its arms.
Yeah.
It's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 plus 4 more from the Suchi is 16.
Yep.
Plus 1 more point of damage during upkeep, which means that, and Victor, I believe, was at 16, so I guess he's just dead.
Yeah, that's what Michael, I think, was going for there, is that he just gets in for the kill all the way.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, certainly. It's high risk, high reward play, right? Victor has the ability to show us the mana drains or the Force Spikes here. Oh, he's got 2 islands. Wow. Just a horrible series of draws. Okay, so Michael just went on the all-in play, and it's kind of a little bit ironic, too, given that in the last game that we covered, he missed a point of life on a potentially lethal attack in a situation almost exactly like that. But there he had no problem doing the math whatsoever and went for the instant kill on Surrender Befreet. That crazy burst damage between Triskelion and an Atog is pretty exceptional. Each one of those Triskelions, without even having to attack, deals 5 damage.
Yeah.
And he had double Atog. Pretty ballsy play. It certainly makes sense to do that before attacking. Is actually a line that I would not have even considered. So he's definitely very versed in how that interaction would go, and pretty ballsy. He's gambling that his opponent doesn't have a Boomerang, which would have screwed up all the plans.
Right.
But he certainly wasn't playing like he had Boomerang. He was taking 4 damage from his Suchi, and that's not something that someone does. So it was a fantastic read by Michael, and recognizing that he had lethal damage right there on the table and going for it, with a little help from his opponent's Surrender Befreet, which is another obviously problem with that creature in the format. The fact that the damage piles up and you don't really have a way of closing out the game, and you wind up actually having to take a fair amount of damage from your own creature without really having the ability to do anything about that.
Yeah.
And that's it. 2-0. Michael advances to the semifinals over Victor, and I'm sure Victor will go back and lick his wounds and consider how he can make some improvements to the deck going forward if he decides to play Four Horsemen again. But he did well enough. He made it to the quarterfinals, and that's all we really ask for usually as Magic players anyway, right?
Yeah. So next time, Brian, we can cover Stephen Goblin King versus Peter Solstice. That's another land tax edge. versus robots variants, and then we'll have covered. We don't have the match between Rob and Roberto, but we'll have covered all the matches, I believe, at that point in the
quarterfinals.
In the quarterfinals, yeah.
Nice. All right, cool. Well, it was very fun covering that game with you again, or those very extremely swift games.
Yeah, that was brutal. It was brutal.
Like in terms of actual gameplay, we talked for about an hour about games that lasted a combined like maybe 5 minutes. But
hey, but Brian, the feedback I've gotten from the videos is people love your insights and your observations about the decks, the construction. It's not just about the tournament, play. It's also about what goes into building these decks, and so people really enjoy your insights, and we really thank you for doing the commentating and donating the time and everything. And looks like we got one more match and we can be through the quarterfinals.
All right. Well, thank you I appreciate the praise, and looking forward to doing that commentary chat. I'll talk to you later.
Okay. Have a great day, Brian. Thank you so much. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.